Hi, my name is Jacob Zumwalt and I'm a mechanical engineer at Lamar University, and today I want to introduce siphons. So I have a few objectives and topics to go over here. First, I wanted to introduce siphons and give them a clear definition, and then I also wanted to use Bernoulli's equation to help conceptualize the mechanics of a siphon. Finally, I wanted to help describe some of the mechanics using examples and give some potential issues with siphons. Here they are again. And so let's move on to defining a siphon. A siphon is any of a wide variety of devices that involve the flow of liquids through tubes, and generally they convey liquid upwards and then downwards to a lower level, and they have some sort of reservoir from which they draw from. But in order to start a siphon, you need some sort of priming to help it get started. After that, though, the flow is sustained by any sort of suction or immersion. So let's move on to mechanics. Here's Bernoulli's equation. You generally have three terms, but in this one we have it reflected to show that the beginning is equal to the end. So here we know that P is equal to your static pressure, and then that rho GH or PGH is your density times gravity times your height, and that is called your hydrostatic pressure. And then you have that 1/2 rho VA squared, or your velocity squared, and that's just your dynamic pressure. It in itself is an expression or similarly derived and looks very similar to the conservation of energy, but for liquids and using pressure. And it was discovered by Daniel Bernoulli, a Swiss scientist. So let's go over a little bit more in depth those three terms I brought up earlier. So static pressure, not to be confused with hydrostatic pressure, is any sort of pressure that comes from an outside source, like your atmospheric pressure or pressure from a force. Then you have hydrostatic pressure, which is more akin to some kind of potential energy that a fluid gets from the height of a fluid column. It's important to note that it is purely from the height and not any sort of volume above a certain point, just the height. Then there's dynamic pressure, which is attributed to the velocity of the fluid that is flowing. And if you look at these in terms of the energy equation, you have your free energy, which is static pressure. Then you have your hydrostatic pressure, which is similar to potential energy. And then your dynamic pressure, which is similar to kinetic energy. So let's move on to describing the mechanics. Here you can see a figure where you have point 1, 2, and 3, where at point 1 it's at height little h, at point 2 it's at height big H, and then at point 3 it's at height negative d, where 0 is the base of the reservoir. So at point 1 we assume that the velocity is 0, hence your dynamic pressure is 0. Then you have some height h1, which gives it some hydrostatic pressure, and then P1, which gives it some atmospheric pressure or static pressure. Moving on to point 2, we have some dynamic pressure from the velocity it has at the top of the tube. And then we have a higher H, which means we'll have lower hydrostatic pressure. And then we have some other pressure for your static pressure, which is generally lower than your original atmospheric pressure or whatever you have. Now, at point 3, because of the continuity equation, which is a relation from the flow rates in the tube, you have A2V2 is equal to A3V3. And since the diameter of the tube, which is the area that we're referring to here, is constant throughout it, then V2 is equal to V3. Thus, at 3, the velocity is equal to V2, the height is equal to negative d, and then the pressure is once again equal to atmospheric pressure. So I wanted to describe a little bit more intuitively what is happening here. So from point 1 to 2, there is a decrease in your hydrostatic pressure and velocity increases. Thus, the reason why the water flows up the tube is because at the bottom in your reservoir, what you have is higher pressure. And then at the top of the tube, you have some lower pressure due to the difference in your hydrostatic pressure. Thus, the water flows from high to low and then continues flowing through the tube assisted by gravity. So, from point 2 to 3, you have an increase in hydrostatic pressure and velocity, but then your pressures cancel out and you have a loss of potential energy. So, moving on to examples. First, I wanted to go over one that people are most familiar with, which is the toilet. Here you have the siphon at the bottom, where all that water sits, and then you have your reservoir at the top. So you can kind of think of there being two reservoirs, the one where the water flows from, and then the one that sits in the bowl. Now with toilets, there's one important distinction to note is that it doesn't just depend on the height, you actually have to get enough fluid flowing through the pipe in order to start the siphon action. If you pour only a little bit of water slowly into the toilet, what will happen is if you see that pump there at point 20, or that hump, I mean, at point 20, the water will just simply dribble over instead of creating a siphon. Thus, whenever you flush the toilet, it provides enough of a flow rate in order to start that siphon action and drain out the rest of whatever's in your toilet. And then I also wanted to go over bell siphons because I thought they were practical siphon to know. They are widely used in public restrooms, irrigation, and septic systems. And so you have three main parts. There's the reservoir, which holds the water, the bell, which goes over the riser. And the riser is called the riser because the water has to rise up its entire height before it can begin to flow down it and create a siphon. The mechanics upon which this operates is that once the water flows up high enough, that helps prime it, and then once it finally reaches the top, it begins to flow down, and any air that's left above the height of the riser will flow out first, and then the fluid will create a seal and begin to flow out the rest. And it won't stop until there is a gap at the bottom of the bell where air can once again flow in and disrupt the flow of the siphon. Another famous version of this is the greedy cup siphon, where basically is it played as a practical joke where if you filled up your cup too much, maybe you were being greedy with your wine, then it would flow out all over onto you. Now I want to talk about some issues and potential complications. Of course, Bernoulli's equation is a great idea in order to help us understand this mechanics here. Bernoulli's equation fails once you begin to take in a lot of different factors, for example, viscosity and internal losses. But also, it requires some height and will only transport downwards, of course, since it transports from a higher place to some lower place. And then you also need some kind of reservoir in order to provide a source to flow from. And then finally, you have some limited control, which is once it starts flowing, if you try to tweak it, you might end up creating some kind of disruption in the flow, or there will be other ways that you have to get creative in order to control the flow of the siphon. And then also there's cavitation, which occurs whenever low pressures cause liquids to vaporize. And in siphons, of course, if there's vapor, that's a compressible gas, right? So that can halt the flow of the siphon because now there's all that gas there to expand and disrupt the flow. It can also cause damage to equipment because the turbulence and the bubbling of the vapor will cause extensive wear, tear, and corrosion onto equipment, like in this picture here. And that's all. I wanted to say thanks to SlidesGo for giving me this template. And in addition, I used a lot of resources online, for example, YouTube and other creators, but for the most part, I did rely on the understanding that I got from my class book. And that's all. Thank you for listening.